Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Spells. I'm the Program Director for the Kansas Disaster Outreach Program. We really appreciate everyone's participation in this ECHO series. Today is our last session. It's been a wonderful experience and just really excited to close things out, and really appreciate everyone who's been in this ECHO as well as our psychological first aid ECHO that we had previous to this. I know it's been a busy summer, so glad to see everyone. Today's session is going to be recorded. We'll send out a link afterwards so that if you want to see the video or share it with colleagues, it's available. All of the echoes that we offer are available on our website at telehealthrocks.org. We will have all of the sessions from this one up soon, and the sessions from our last one, Psychological First Aid, are already up there. So thanks to everyone for their hard work on that. Please mute your phone, your Zoom, if possible. Just make sure it's muted, and of course you'll be able to unmute to ask questions or participate in the breakouts or things like that. We'd like to have people turn their cameras on if at all possible, so they can participate and everybody can see each other. It's okay if you're eating or anything else, although if it gets really gross, I always turn my camera off, so it's up to you. Sorry, I can't read my notes here, so continuing ed certificates will be sent out after today's session. We wait till the end of the sessions. And it's really important if you have or don't have a name on your Zoom name, you can use your right mouse, click over on the three dots over your name, and that'll allow you to rename yourself, and that helps us know who's participating. We'll be sending those out, and if you don't receive your continuing education certificate, or if it doesn't have the right number of sessions, for some reason, just let us know and we'll get that corrected or make sure you get your certificate. And then today's presenters will be Melissa and Joa. So very excited to hand things off to Melissa, who's going to get us started today.
Terrific. Thank you, Robert. And hello, everyone, and happy Wednesday. We are very excited to be here with you to conclude this 4-series ECHO on SPR. And we know that at least some of you all also were with us for our PFA or psychological first aid training. So it has been a lot of fun learning with you this summer. So Joe and I are at the helm today. Erin is actually out. And so Joe and I will be facilitating today's conversation. If we can go to the next slide, Christy. And as Christy is transitioning to the next slide, also just wanted to, again, thank her and Robert for everything they do to facilitate these echoes. There is a lot of work behind the scenes that goes into wrangling us and all the details. And so thank you both again very much for all your support here. In terms of disclosures, we still do not have any financial relationship with any kind of commercial interest, as Robert was sharing. All of the information from the echoes, the recordings, the chats, the resources we share are publicly available. And we not only invite you to access those, but also to share them freely with your communities as you see fit. And also, we don't intend to discuss anything that would be of commercial use. We can go to the next slide, Christy. In terms of bias, we are sharing today and have shared the best of what we know from science. Science is, of course, always evolving, and we try to evolve with it. But what we're sharing with you today is based on evidence and research, and we will, to the best of our ability, try to respond to questions if anybody has any with what we know from the research base. We can go to the next slide, please, Christy. After the session, again, the presentation materials, the slides, and the chat log will be emailed to you. Completion certificates will be emailed. And after this ECHO in particular, be on the lookout for the post survey about this SPR series. We really, really appreciate those of you all who completed the pre-survey, and we would really appreciate, and we'll give you another reminder at the end to complete the post-survey. We do use those data not only for ongoing improvement, of course, but also to be able to advocate for additional funding so we can provide trainings like this to friends like you and other folks in the community. So please take a few minutes and respond to that. We timed it 5 minutes or less of your time, and so we'd appreciate your response to that. We can go to the next slide, Christy. So our agenda for today, we have 2 more skills to cover. So skill 3, promoting positive activities, and skill 5, promoting helpful thinking. We are going to try to stay on track to have a break, a 5-minute break right around 1:45, and are then going to head into our breakout rooms to do some application and some practice. As Robert suggested, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions or share resources. Even as people are presenting, there are several of us on the call from the team, and we will monitor the chat and respond and make sure that those questions get answered. So if we want to go to the next slide, we'll start talking about positive activities. So promoting positive activities is one of the 6 core SPR skills. Next slide, please. So promoting positive activities. The goal here is around helping survivors plan and engage in positive, pleasurable, or meaningful activities to improve mood and help regain a sense of control. And our rationale here is actually pretty complex, even though it seems really straightforward and simple. We know that disasters and other traumatic events often disrupt normal routines and activities that people engage in, give them a sense of purpose, control, and pleasure. And engaging in positive activities can be a really powerful way to really jumpstart a person's recovery, or to help them continue in their recovery following a disaster or some other situation. One of kind of the things that I probably say more than most things when I'm talking to friends level is just value, consistency, and predictability. We talk and predictability are essential for all of us. And that happens, it can disrupt that normal routine. And so that consistency and predictability is really critical in terms of really getting on the path to recovery. Positive activities also can improve our mood. The idea of planning and then actually doing a positive activity can promote self-efficacy because we have control over something. If the positive activity is something that is with other people, that can be connected to social support, can help us foster physical activity, which has all kinds of physiological benefits. And one of the things that I really like about this skill is that it naturally involves the other skills. So both Joe and I are going to try to highlight today, as we're talking about these skills, how these actually linked to things that we've talked about over the past 3 sessions. Just a reminder, the SPR manual is available online for free. The manual is terrific. The handouts and the appendices are really, really fantastic and great resources just to have. So please check those out, but we will try to refer back to those throughout the session today and the other skills that we have covered the last 3 weeks. We can go to the next slide, Christy. So in terms of promoting positive activities, this may be particularly helpful for survivors who identify concerns, because remember, as part of SPR, we're working with survivors to identify their primary concerns and really prioritizing that. But when survivors identify concerns about feeling down or apathetic, so feeling low energy,
Melissa, this is Robert. Your audio is dragging. I wonder if maybe we could turn off your video. It seems like you might have a slow connection.
Absolutely.
Send her a message and hopefully she has heard. We'll try to get her audio fixed and see if turning off her video helps. Just 1 second, guys. Thanks for your patience.
All right, so this is perfect time for a pop quiz. Now, in this situation, what SPR skill should we use to try to figure out how to deal with the situation? We have an unpredictable, unforeseen technological challenge, right? Sounds like a good time for problem solving to me. So we'll just have to brainstorm some solutions here, right? But folks, I can I'll jump in here once, and so in the sake of brainstorming some ways that we can sort of handle this. Melissa and I, both are sort of knowledgeable and familiar with some of the concepts here. So while we try to loop Melissa back in to see if she can join us, hopefully we'll be able to reestablish a good connection there.
She's all the way cut off. So Joe, if you want to continue us, maybe.
Sure. No, I can definitely do that. And happy to jump in here. But in thinking about just, picking up where Melissa is, and hopefully if she's able to join us, we'll kind of come back in. And first of all, good afternoon, everyone. So let me just also say, good to see you all here again. And I can't believe we actually have found ourselves here at the last Echo series, or the last session of our Echo series here together. But as Melissa was sort of saying, we're really going to be talking a lot about the final two core skills here in problem solving and thinking about how we sort of help folks approach and really revise and sort of examine different kinds of thoughts that are often associated with the kinds of things that we've lived through following a traumatic event. And in building on what Melissa first introduced here, the first core skill that we're talking about is promoting positive activities. And just to loop in and to kind of bring myself up to speed a bit with where Melissa was, I do want to also say that I think this particular module is one that is extremely important. I think this is one that actually you'll find resonates with survivors of all ages. Folks have experienced a lot of different kinds of traumatic experiences or disasters. And it's one that I think intuitively makes sense to folks. And this is a skill that, when studied outside the context of SPR, has been shown to be associated with improvements in a whole range of mental health reactions, from post-traumatic stress, depression, prolonged grief, overall quality of life and health functioning, you name it. But when thinking about scheduling positive activities, let's just spend a little bit of time kind of thinking about what's behind this incredibly powerful, incredibly robust skill that I think is often helpful to remind folks about. So when we think about it, this is going to be a skill, as Melissa was sort of saying before we ran into our technological challenges, right? This is a skill that's often going to be helpful for folks who are really feeling kind of down or apathetic. And certainly when we've talked about the range of reactions that folks have to trauma or other kinds of disaster-related situations, post-traumatic stress symptoms are one of the most common types of reactions that come to mind for many of us, I think. But so can changes in our mood. Depression is also very common, right? It can sometimes be one of the more common types of reactions that we'll see when we're working with survivors. And again, depending on the types of samples that we're talking about, some studies suggest that depressive reactions may actually be more common than post-traumatic stress or other kinds of reactions that people might endorse. So this is going to be a skill for folks that are especially starting to feel down or kind of apathetic, and as a result are finding that maybe I'm just not doing as many of the things that are actually meaningful or that used to be meaningful and enjoyable to me in my life, right? And sometimes that's also just a function of the reality that following a trauma or other kind of disaster, we may find that we don't have the resources available to us to allow us to continue engaging in different kinds of activities in the same ways, right? So I think that this can be really, really important for folks, not just those who are sort of feeling down, but for people who've experienced a real disruption in kind of daily routine, right? Where maybe especially we're not doing as many of the things in our daily lives that we used to do that were an important source of meaning and pleasure for us. And so again, folks oftentimes may find that we start to, find that we're not able to engage in as many pleasurable or positive activities, not just because we lack the resources to do that, but also because, we may also find that now much more of our time in a post-disaster or post-trauma context is spent trying to help manage other kinds of issues that might come up, right? So sometimes even if we have the resources available to us to continue doing things that are personally meaningful, we may just find that so much more of our time is invested in other areas, right? Or there are new demands placed on our time that weren't there before. So for all these reasons, these are things to kind of listen for. When you first start doing something like skills for psychological recovery with someone, remember the very first thing that you do is try to gather information about what their most pressing needs are and what areas of their life have been most directly affected. Listen for folks when talking about their most immediate needs. Listen for sort of those little indicators that tell you that maybe a person's day-to-day life in terms of their overall role functioning has just been really impacted, right? And that they're missing a lot of the things that were previously important to them. So that can be a good cue that this is going to be a really helpful skill to use with folks. And so children who've stopped playing or are in some ways engaged in high-risk, dangerous play, right? Again, this can be helpful for those kids and those youth. Just especially in thinking about, rather than engaging in dangerous or high risk play, or not engaging in play with others where you're getting opportunities to experience pleasure or other kinds of positive reinforcement, how do we help build that back in, right? How do we help reestablish new normal sort of routines that include opportunities to really experience joy and happiness again? So that's kind of the main sort of things that I look for when we think about why a module like this is helpful and who in particular a module like this is going to be helpful for. So Christy, if we can jump to the next slide here. Let's just think a little bit about sort of what the primary steps in this particular module are. So the very first thing that we want to do is just try to explain the rationale for this. Okay, so why do we want to encourage people at a time like this in the sort of early aftermath of a trauma or disaster to start doing fun, meaningful things again, especially when for many people, that may seem like the lowest thing kind of on your priority list, right? Why would we encourage you to start doing some more of these things? Well, I'll tell you, I think you can practice explaining this rationale to folks in a lot of different ways. Find a way that makes sense for you, right? For all the modules that we've talked about throughout this series, find a way to explain it to folks in a way that resonates for you personally. Because if you understand it, the folks that you're talking to are going to understand it as well. But I think this is one that folks intuitively get, right? This is one that just makes a lot of sense to most folks. On average, the more we're doing things or the more we're spending our time in activities that mean something to us or that make us happy, the better we're going to feel, right? And that's kind of the meat of it. That's the gist of it. So when we think about the rationale, it makes sense to folks. It resonates with people, right? So on average, if I'm doing things that make me happy, I'm probably going to feel better more often, right? The more I'm doing those things, the better I'm going to feel. So this is one that, again, I think, rather in contrast to some of the other modules where we've kind of gone over, much more complex rationales for why some of these skills are important, this is one that just, I think really sticks for folks and really resonates with most folks. And so, the second step, once we've sort of talked with folks about the importance of why this is going to be an important skill, we want to just sit down and really kind of help people think about how to identify and plan an activity or more often plan a variety of activities, right? A range of different kind of activities that are going to give you greater opportunity to experience joy or pleasure and different kind of things. And so one of the things that if you look at the SPR manual, right, you start thinking about some of the different activities that are going to be relevant for folks, you'll see that the manual kind of also talks a bit about breaking things down between activities that you can do by yourself or things that you can do with other people. And I think that actually, I strongly feel that we should encourage folks to do a variety of both, and I think there's a good clinical reason why we should do that. You'll see that there are handouts in there that kind of break down a number of different activities or give folks ideas about different activities that you can do alone or with other people. So please take a look at those handouts. They can often be helpful in just generating ideas for folks. But I'm curious, at least at this point in me saying that, why do folks here kind of think that it's important to help people plan a variety of activities that include both things you can do by yourself and things that involve other people? What's really key about having that variety and having a little bit of both? Yeah, so I see that. Yeah, Brian, you said sort of trying to regain, trying to regain some sort of control or some routine, right? Having options, yeah. And Janice, you said having options there, and I think absolutely right. Having a variety of options there is going to be important. And so I noticed Melissa's back on, so here in just a second, she'll kind of loop back around and talk a little bit more about this. To keep from isolating, yeah. And so Deborah, I appreciate you saying that. Absolutely, very important here, right? And having options, keeping from isolating, all those things are key. But I think that driving home that options idea, right? Remember when we talked about brainstorming solutions, when we talked about the brainstorming module, we talked about why you want to brainstorm lots of different options when thinking about how to solve a problem. And it's no different in planning positive activities. Because sometimes we may say, I really used to enjoy doing something before the disaster or the trauma happened. But when we start to do something again in this new, forever changed world, we may find that the impact that it has on us now is somewhat different, right? Or that when we do it, didn't really enjoy it as much as we used to, right? So having options is going to be important, and having options that involve social connections is going to be really important too, especially given that those social connections or those social activities can help make it more likely that we actually might start doing something pleasurable again, right? How many times have we said, well, there's this thing that I would like to go do, but then we end up not doing it, right? But maybe we are more likely to do it if a trusted friend or family member is there with us and sort of, gives us a call and says, hey, are we still going to go do this thing? You told me we were going to go, so come on, let's go. Let's get out and go do it. So it kind of adds a different level of accountability and makes it more likely sometimes that we'll take those initial steps towards doing positive and meaningful things. So plan a variety of activities that you might enjoy doing that include both solitary and social activities. But then make sure that we try to schedule those activities. And so here in a little while, when I turn it back over to Melissa, she'll talk a bit about kind of the importance of scheduling and why scheduling is so important. And of course, because SPR, unlike immediate acute crisis interventions like psychological first aid, is a multi-session sort of intervention that allows for follow-up, check in with folks and see how it went, right? When you did those activities, how did you feel doing it? And how was it kind of starting to do those things again? Or how much did you enjoy these new things? And how do you see this kind of fitting into your new life going forward, right? So this is a really sort of at face value, straightforward skill, but a skill that has a lot of impact and sort of packs a lot of punch when we think about sort of helping folks begin to move towards that path of recovery following a trauma or other kinds of disaster. And so I noticed one other thing here that was just mentioned in chat. Joyce, you sort of added here just the consistency in implementing activities that are scheduled, right? And absolutely, when we talk about the importance of scheduling, having some consistency and creating conditions where we're more likely to follow through, right, is going to be really, really important. And if we can build in things that are predictable, that starts to go a long way in terms of just restoring a sense of normalcy, right? So that's incredibly important too. And Corey, I noticed that you said that, trauma affects everyone differently, so it might take different activities to find the right one. And that's absolutely the case, right? So I think that we also need to give ourselves a lot of options, right? Just because one thing might work for someone or just because one thing used to work for us doesn't mean that it will now. So how do we sort of find that right combination of things that now mean the most to us in this changed world, right? So all these things I think are really important. And Vernetta, I noticed you said just having options in case there's change, right? Because that's going to be important too. Change unfolds rapidly in the first few weeks and months, sometimes after a trauma or disaster. So I really appreciate all these points that you're all making here, and these just sort of speak to some sort of more nuanced kinds of issues that we'll want to be thoughtful about as we think about how to implement some of these steps. But Melissa, I saw that you're back on here, so I'll pass the stick back off to you, and I'll let you take back over here, and then I'll jump back in. Shortly, but I appreciate everyone's engagement here, and let's just continue thinking a bit about how to do this in the context of an early intervention like SPR.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joa. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, awesome. I am so incredibly sorry, and Joa, thank you for hopping on. I kind of wish you all could have been here, and you'll appreciate this, the collective groan that just kind of reverberated through the house as the internet went down. So hopefully this will work. If it does not, please say something and we'll transition back. So thank you, Joe, for talking that through. If we want to go to the next slide, Christy. I'm guessing Joe may have covered this a little bit, but in terms of, again, that first step with planning positive activities, the first being explaining the rationale. So one of the important parts of SPR really is that psychoeducation. So helping people understand why they might be feeling what they're feeling, why they might be thinking what they're thinking, and really trying to help people connect the dots. So with this part and this step in terms of explaining the rationale, we just want to validate any of the hard or sad or icky feelings that are really common after a disaster. So when we think back to the managing reactions module in SPR, this is what we're talking about. So these feelings are a natural response, and just validating that we hear those. But then taking this to the next level and really trying to explain how feelings are linked to thoughts and behaviors. So this triangle up at the top right of the screen might look familiar to folks, but this idea that our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are connected. And kind of like what Joe was saying, this might seem really obvious to some people, but it's not obvious to a whole lot of people. For a lot of people, feelings are kind of magical. They come out of nowhere. We can't control them. We can't understand them. And so when we start talking about how feelings are actually connected to our thoughts and our behaviors, what it offers is a sense of opportunity and a sense of something that we can actually affect. And really sort of emphasizing for this step, this idea that if we can control our behaviors or some of our behaviors, control what we do, our actions, activities, that it can actually have a positive impact on our feelings. Joe's going to talk here in a second about the other module around positive thinking or helpful thinking. That's the third part of this triangle. But again, and how we talk about this varies, and we would talk about this differently to grownups and to kids. The bottom right part of the screen is actually a visual that's in the SPR manual. But this idea that after something difficult or bad, after a disaster has happened, that it's really normal or natural for us to have some bad or some icky or hard feelings inside. So part of what we want to do in terms of planning positive activities is to do things that can pour some other feelings in there. We're not trying to say that any feeling is wrong or that people shouldn't feel the way that they feel, but the idea that if we can re-engage in some of those positive experiences, that it actually can help us feel better. And that's what we're trying to do. If you can go to the next slide, Christy. So in terms of promoting positive activities, the SPR manual, and you can see kind of two clips for this here. There are some worksheets for kids and for adults. But really this idea that step one, again, explaining the rationale, explaining, the mystery behind this step, and helping people understand the connection between thoughts and feelings and actions. And then the second one, really coming up with some ideas of what we can do. And so on these worksheets, there are some listed out. So indoor activities, outdoor activities, activities with other people, so that social support, rebuilding activities, so ways to contribute or to help someone else can be of value. But at this point in the process, in terms of promoting positive activities, the idea is just to brainstorm. So again, this is very similar to the problem-solving skill. We're just trying to identify potential activities that could happen. And then once we have those activities or one activity or several activities, drilling down to the specifics. We know that if someone can specify some of those details around an activity, they are much more likely to actually do it. So this goes from, going to the park to, on Tuesday afternoon, I'm going to walk to the park with my friend John, and we are going to go to the baseball field and toss a ball around in the afternoon, right? And so the more detail that we can try to evoke, the more likely that behavior is in terms of that it's likely to happen. And you can see here that it's actually about scheduling the activity in a calendar. Again, consistency, routine, predictability. A lot of people, young people and grownups, you'll see after something really difficult happens or times of really high anxiety, making to-do lists, right, that they can check off and order and control. And part of that is just trying to organize life. And so if we can actually put it on a calendar, we can see it, we can visualize it, more likely to commit to it and more likely to follow through. So again, what we're trying to do is get that positive boost of good feelings, those positive feelings that can come from engaging in these kinds of positive activities. And as Joe was saying, ideally there would be an opportunity to follow up. And if there is, to check in about how it went, right? And so this is an opportunity for accountability, right? So accountability for self and others, but then also to problem solve if it didn't happen. And so that you can come up with a new activity and talk that through. The critical piece here, of course, is praising the effort. If someone tried to start moving towards doing this activity, if they even thought about it, if they remembered, right? Praising that effort, and then again, going back to problem solving to kind of think through different sorts of activities that a friend might have more success with. If we can go to the next slide, Christy. So with, as with all of the modules, there are kind of a lot of things to consider here. And as we're coming up with activities, and so we wanted to talk about these both in terms of the provider, so someone who is actually providing SPR, and then there's also some cultural components that we wanted to address. I think one of the things that's important to remember is as people begin to engage in these kinds of activities after a disaster or after a difficult period, the person might experience these activities in a different kind of way. So something that used to bring a lot of enjoyment or pleasure or good feelings may not have the same kinds of impacts after something has happened. And it also may not have an immediate impact on mood. And so we don't want to oversell anything as the magic potion, right? It's not that, you know, being able to read for 15 minutes on my Kindle on Wednesday is going to magically help me feel all better and make all the difficult feelings go away. It means that we're moving towards something in that consistency and predictability. And the way to address this is to be proactive around it. So give people the heads up, talk to the adults around a young person, and especially, you know, if they might be involved in the activity, talk about that this might happen and that we want to support ourselves and the children and adolescents we're with, just around what to expect, and encourage people to do it anyway. And so it might not be an overnight sort of magical kind of thing, but if we continue to do that, if we continue to engage in these positive activities over time, there's a really good likelihood that we will see a positive impact on mood. One of the pieces that I've often found to be successful is, if possible, focus on kind of basic self-care kinds of activities that may have some sort of more immediate physiological impact. So when we're thinking about mood, when we're thinking about someone saying that they're dragging, that they don't have a lot of energy, thinking about ways that we can get our body moving, getting into the sunlight, getting some fresh air, and kind of having that in the back of our mind. And again, this is where in the SPR manual, when we think about managing reactions after a disaster, this kind of information can be really, really helpful. So at this point in delivering SPR, you've gathered information from the individual, from the survivor. So you have ideas of what happened, how it's impacted them. And so this is where we can kind of try to be brainstorming with our friend, with the survivor, about activities that might be a good match for any kinds of physical or emotional responses we're having that might be negative. So if someone is really tired, again, getting outside, getting some fresh air. The other benefit, if we can figure out a way to link it to that immediate sort of body feeling, that positive body feeling, is that it will have a more immediate effect. This is one of the reasons that if we can get people to do mindfulness exercises and relaxation exercises, a lot of times it sticks because immediately people feel better. More oxygen is going to their brain, they feel better. And so another kind of benefit for the physiological component. And absolutely encouraging connection to social supports and contributing meaningfully to others. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but oftentimes when something happens to us that is really difficult, one of the best things we can do is actually try to figure out how to help someone else. And research has shown this. This actually activates part of our brain. It helps with the healing process. Kind of some other kind of caveats or things to consider is that, of course, planning activities in the aftermath of a disaster is going to be different and may be challenging, right? And so kind of what I picture here is, a really, tragic natural disaster. And here comes somebody with SBR saying, let's make a plan to do an activity that's completely unrealistic. And that's not what we want to do, right? We want to be realistic about the resources that families have and what can actually happen. And this is, again, where that problem solving really comes into play. We want this to be successful. So we don't want to plan something that can't actually happen. Again, this is also where the information that you've gathered during the information component of SPR will be really helpful. If you know something that is triggering for a person and somebody's identified that, you can keep that in the back of your mind while you're talking about a potential activity. If you know something that someone used to engage in and enjoy, then that can come up as you're talking through that. And again, this is all around the problem solving skills and all of these resources we've talked about so far. So be realistic, engage a broader social support network. So if a family has, for example, lost their home, it's going to be a time that we might need to engage people outside of the immediate family to work on the positive planning for activities. Avoid too much isolated passive time. Be aware of screen time. Be aware of social media. This is a reality. It doesn't mean that those things are bad or good. It just means to pay attention to it. And just a reminder that a positive activity doesn't have to be going to Disney World, right? It doesn't have to be big and elaborate. What we're talking about is something that might help somebody feel good, right? And so it can be really small. And in a lot of ways, the smaller, the better. We, again, want to find a positive activity that is very realistic to actually achieve and to do so that we can start building on those positive feelings moving forward. We can go to the next slide, Christy. And then finally, just wanted to kind of once again remind all of us that when we are working with survivors, this is about them and their lens and their culture, the community context, and that particularly when we're thinking about grief and loss and death, there are a lot of rituals and expectations and kind of community activities, family activities that might go along with death and loss. And so we want to be sensitive to that. A lot of times those kinds of rituals are time sensitive. So again, we don't want to try to impose this positive activity planning during a time when we could actually do more harm than good. So just being sensitive to that and really just being aware of that. And again, in the information gathering part of SPR, hopefully we're learning more about what is important in terms of culture and context and that individual lens so that we can kind of take that into account. And again, with all things, trying to be aware and being responsive and just practicing cultural humility, right? When we learn something, that means we know, more now than we just did, and we can move forward with that. And I added this kind of phrase here. This is kind of my catch-all for when I don't know what to say or I'm realizing, wow, I just really stepped in it, is this idea of just tell me more. Right. So when my child comes and asks to do something that really is, frankly, scary or dangerous or strange, I try not to respond and I say, tell me more, right? To buy myself some time so that I can then kind of think of that. And I think this is often a place where when we realize that maybe we misstepped or we misspoke, just asking someone to continue to explain their perspective is a really good strategy most of the time. Tell me more about that so I can understand and then use that information in terms of making plans for next steps. So with that, we're going to wrap up the positive activity planning. And Joa, I'm going to hand this back over to you all. Again, Joa, thank you for being at the ready to field the transition there. And thank you all for everything you commented on in the chat. Some really great conversation about how positive activity planning can be a really valuable part in terms of recovery after a disaster. So Joa, I will hand it back to you.
Good deal. Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for again walking us through some of the things to consider when you're thinking about what goes into positive activity planning with folks. And so, you know, the next sort of piece that we'll talk a bit about today, which is the last primary skill that we're going to talk about, or the last core skill that's an essential part of SPR, or skills for psychological recovery, is this idea of promoting helpful thinking. And so let's spend a little bit of time just thinking about that. And being mindful of where we are with time. I'll kind of try to move us through this as quickly as possible so we have time for a break as well before we start to go into the second half of our echo today. But if we can go to the next slide, let's just talk a bit about what this module is, why we use this skill, and who this skill is going to be helpful for, compared to say who might be better suited for something like positive activity planning or positive activity scheduling, right? So promoting helpful thinking is, again, very similar to what it sounds like, right? Here we just want to help folks sort of find ways to think differently in a helpful or maybe more adaptive way about some of the situations, contexts, experiences that they're having to, again, try to help promote recovery in the aftermath of trauma or disaster. So this is going to be a skill that's particularly useful for survivors who maybe are endorsing things like a high degree of self-criticism, right? So sometimes after a trauma or disaster happens, it's not unusual that we may criticize ourselves for actions that we took or maybe didn't take, wishing that we had done something different, right? And so we may criticize ourselves for what happened at the time, for how we responded in the aftermath, or maybe even for what we've done since then, right? So for folks that are experiencing a lot of self-criticism, this can be something that can be particularly important to work with folks on in terms of skill development. But I think this is also a really important skill to consider, at least, when working with folks who are reporting a lot of negative beliefs, particularly around distressing emotions that they may have related to the trauma or the disaster, or if folks maybe have negative beliefs about physical reactions that they're having associated with the trauma or disaster, this can be particularly useful or helpful as well. So, you know, a term that sometimes we use in the clinical literature that comes to mind as I am talking a little bit about this, that maybe some folks out there have heard used is something called sort of anxiety sensitivity, right? Where sometimes maybe we notice that we're having certain kinds of upsetting feelings. We might notice that we're feeling a lot of fear, or we're feeling a lot of sadness, or we're feeling emotions very similar to what we felt at the time the disaster was happening or the trauma was happening. Or we notice that we're having physical reactions very similar to what we had at the time that those events were happening, right? And when we experience those emotions, when we notice those physical sensations, sometimes we can interpret those sensations and feelings as being really dangerous and threatening, right? Or we may feel that if we start to allow ourselves to experience those things, that it means there's something wrong with us, right? Or that we're kind of like going crazy, right? And so those things that we tell ourselves about those experiences are beliefs, right? They're trauma-related beliefs that can often lend themselves well to a skill like promoting helpful thinking. So this is going to be really helpful for folks who are endorsing some of these primary concerns, but let's spend just a little bit of time next talking about what kinds of thoughts folks might experience. So, you know, I mentioned negative beliefs around distressing emotions or physical reactions, but certainly trauma affects the way that we view ourselves, other people, and the world in a number of profound ways. So what are some common concerns that folks might have that you might hear folks tell you about when they come to see you after this echo is done, right? that might alert you to thinking, hey, maybe teaching some helpful thinking skills would be helpful here. So if we go to the next slide, let's just think about some common beliefs that folks will often report, right? The kids may report, that sometimes adults will report, but certainly, as you can kind of see reflected on the screen here, there are a lot of ways that we might think about ourselves and the world differently after trauma or disaster. Sometimes we may feel like things will always be like this, like we're going to be stuck in this place forever, right? This place that emotionally me and my family are, we're going to be, things are not going to ever be better again, right? Sometimes, especially when we're talking about with kids may feel particularly helpless to be able to do things to contribute to the overall family, may not know how to help out, right? And may feel that I can't do anything to help my family. And as we all know, kiddos really want to be involved. They want to be an active part of helping the family and their community recover, but sometimes may not feel that there's anything they can do. When we start to think about going back to school, right? If we're talking about trauma or disaster, sometimes we're forced to relocate schools, or maybe we're forced to change schools. You may feel like, I don't know how I'll ever fit in here. This new school doesn't want me. Or you may find that just the way that you understand yourself in the context of the world more broadly in terms of safety, control, trust, esteem, all have been fundamentally altered in some way, in the sense that we may not feel safe. We may feel that we're never safe in any circumstance ever again, having just lived through this horrible event, right? Or we may feel that bad things will always happen to us because of what we've seen firsthand and what we've continued to see unfold firsthand. So these are just some examples, certainly not an exhaustive list. I think we could all probably go around together and think about other thoughts that we've probably heard folks in our own work tell us, or maybe even from our own personal experiences, could think of different kinds of ways that thoughts related to the trauma or disaster might be likely to come up for us, right? But these are some common thoughts that I think also fortunately lend themselves well to a skill like promoting helpful thinking, right? So this is the kind of thing that we want to try to focus on targeting with this particular kind of skill and this particular kind of module. And so there's going to be 4 steps involved in this process. And let me kind of walk you through the steps in this process. And we'll kind of go through some examples of thinking about how you might do this, particularly with kiddos and young folks. And then we'll wrap up for our break and then take a little bit of time to practice this skill in breakout rooms when we come back. But let's go to the next slide if we can, and just think about sort of the first overall step in this particular skill, right? In promoting helpful thinking. Well, if we want to help folks think about challenging, identifying, and revising unhelpful thoughts, the very first step is really going to be learning how to actually identify unhelpful thoughts when they pop up. Okay, so the first thing that we want to try to do is help survivors identify potentially unhelpful thoughts, but make sure that you understand how to connect those unhelpful thoughts to their impact on how you're feeling and how you're behaving, right? And so Melissa mentioned this earlier in her section when she was talking about positive activity scheduling. She kind of went through the cognitive behavioral triangle that you can see sort of included here. And I imagine many of you out there are familiar with some of the core components of cognitive behavioral theory. But I think this is where a good place to start can just be to go through kind of the rationale of this overall view and this overall model with folks, and including kids. I think it's helpful to go through and make sure that kids understand the connections between all these pieces too, right? And what does this model say, right? This is really just a helpful way of helping us break down different situations into component parts that we can focus on, modify, and change, right? So this just kind of presumes that any sort of situation that we think about trying to work with, where we're trying to change something, we can probably break down into 3 key pieces, right? What happened and the behaviors that we engaged in, right? What we were thinking at the time, right? Or those words that kind of go through our mind, or maybe the mental images that kind of came to our mind. And then the emotions that were associated with those behaviors, events, and thoughts, right? So what were the feelings that we had in response to all those things, right? And as Melissa was just talking about positive activity scheduling, she was kind of really, highlighting the bottom part of this triangle here, which is really the key part of what we mean by positive activity scheduling, that sometimes creating new events through new behaviors can lead to better feelings, right? But it's also the case that we can lead to changes in mood. We can change our mood. We can change how we feel by also changing the thoughts piece, right? So I think we can really intervene at either level here. And so with this skill, we're talking about intervening at that first piece, identifying unhelpful thoughts, and understand the feelings that come up for you when you're aware of those unhelpful thoughts, right? And I think that's really, really key in making sure that this particular skill works. And so as I keep talking about that, let's kind of come back to that idea, and I'll kind of ask for some questions and some feedback from other folks, and thinking about, just why that's important and why that's sort of a key piece of what makes the helpful thinking skill so impactful when we use it with folks, and to really help people sort of learn how to do this. But the overall idea here, again, is that we just want folks to understand that how you think probably affects how you feel. And it might even affect how likely you are to do different kinds of things, right? So that's one opportunity for us to intervene and change things. So how do you explain this to folks, right? How would you kind of go through this rationale with folks, and in particular with kiddos, right? What's one way that you could talk about this with kids? So if we go to the next slide, one way that I think you can kind of think about explaining this to kids in particular in a way that might help them kind of understand what we're doing with the skill and why we're doing it is to kind of just talk about what's happening on a rainy day, right? So think about an example of two boys, maybe who, each are at their separate houses. And one morning, they both wake up in their separate houses and they notice that it's raining outside, right? It's just, it's a soaker. It's really just, pouring down. You're not gonna rain all day long, right? So just settle in, get used to it. And the first boy wakes up, sees that it's raining hard outside, and he thinks to himself like, oh, this is horrible. There's gonna be a terrible storm coming. If it's a really bad storm, we might lose power, or we could have, our house could get damaged. I'm not going to get to go to baseball practice today. This is awful, right? So if he's thinking that to himself, right, what kind of feelings are probably coming up for him? We think about what he's probably feeling when he's thinking that, looking outside of his bedroom window, noticing it's raining. What's he probably feeling? Anybody? Sad, yeah. So sad, probably feeling kind of lonely, right? Sad, yeah, down. So for all those reasons, right? Because of just the flavor, the nature of those thoughts, right? He's probably going to be feeling sort of down. But the other boy over across town, on the other side of town, probably just a few streets over. Well, he woke up and he looked outside of his bedroom window, saw that it was raining, and first thing he kind of thought was, oh, this is excellent. I love playing in the rain. This is going to be so much fun. I'm going to get to go play in the rain today. And you know what? I get to miss that boring baseball practice I didn't want to go to anyway. So this is great. This is fantastic, right? Now, what's he probably feeling? Happy, excited, right? So same context, same situation, two very different styles of thinking, two very different feelings, right? So, and energetic, right? So yeah, exactly. And that's really sort of the key here. So part of what we want to try to do is, I think we can talk with youth, right? We can even give similar examples when working with adults. So just be flexible and creative in that. But help folks kind of see that there's a connection there, right? To start off with, that how we're thinking does shape how we're feeling. Okay, and so you can both have you can have the exact same situation, but you can think about it in very different ways, and how we think about it is probably going to lead to very different kinds of feelings. So the first thing is just kind of give a rationale for what we're doing and help folks learn how to identify some of the unhelpful thoughts that they might be having about things. And there's different ways that you can do that too. If I'm working with older adolescents or adults, I might even ask, when you think about the event, what kinds of reactions do you have? And as you focus on those reactions, what thoughts do you have? What words come through your mind, right? What are you kind of thinking about? And so that takes a little practice for folks who are new to this particular skill. You know, we all kind of are used to thinking things in our mind throughout the day, but we don't often pay attention to it a lot of the times, right? Sometimes we do, but a lot of times we don't. So this is really getting folks to slow down and notice, what is it that I'm telling myself in my mind, particularly in these certain contexts. So if we go then to the next slide, let's think about the second step here, which is having brought folks to a place where they understand that how we think about things does impact how we feel about things. We can then start to identify unhelpful thoughts that we're having, but then work with folks to start identifying potentially helpful thoughts, right? And their impact on mood and behavior, right? Because again, we want to give folks the opportunity to start creating personally relevant beliefs and see how the beliefs that they create to challenge unhelpful thoughts helps them personally feel different, right? So when working with kids, there are a lot of different ways, again, that we can kind of do this. And one way that, we can do that sometimes is to just have kids draw stick figures. I've seen sort of, clinicians do this in different protocols, including SPR, where maybe you just have a kid draw 2 different stick figures with thought bubbles coming up above each one, and you can have the child write a negative thought about a particular situation that comes to mind for them in one bubble, and then have them sort of pick a crayon and color in the feelings that they're having that they think, sort of reflect the overall vibe of the emotion that's tied to that particular thought. And then in the next stick figure, right, have them write a helpful thought. Think of something that they could say to themselves that would be more helpful, that would feel better, that would help them feel more positive, and then use a different color crayon to draw that in. And you can kind of have them personify the figures, right? Help them give different names to the helpful thinking figure and the non-helpful thinking figure, so that just gives them helpful ways to get these ideas to stick in their minds, so that they can sort of label them more clearly when they notice them happening in their natural environments, right? There's another example in the SPR manual, and again, just for the sake of time, I'll refer folks to check this out on your own, so please go back and look at it. But there's a really nice little exercise in there for older kids and adolescents in particular, called Good Coach, Bad Coach, right? So, you can kind of think about times where maybe, think of an athlete that you really like, that you really respect, maybe did something, things didn't go the way they were planning, right? Mahomes threw an interception, right? Uh-oh. Well, if Coach Reed did a good job and he was a good coach, what do you think he said to him over on the sideline? Now, if he had had a bad coach, right, what would the bad coach have said to him after he threw an interception, and how would that likely make him feel, right? So you can use lots of different creative little ways to help folks understand these concepts in ways that resonate with them. But again, to really sort of get the feel for how this is likely going to help you the most, understand the effect that it has on your mood, because the goal, again, is really to help change how we feel about things, and in particular to help sort of create more positive affect in a way that we'll feel more energized and ready to start engaging in different kinds of recovery-oriented activities in different parts of our lives. So with that, let me just pause here for a second and give folks an opportunity to ask any questions about anything that I've covered here so far. I know I kind of gave a super fast overview of cognitive restructuring, sort of. This is kind of cognitive restructuring light for folks maybe that are familiar with CBT or cognitive behavioral protocols. Or for those of you who are new to this, in particular, this can be kind of a challenging skill to learn. I think especially to learn how to do well. But just questions or comments folks have before we move on. And it's okay if not to, because we'll talk about this some more when we come back. Okay, well, I'm going to keep moving on here, but I will keep an eye out on the chat in case anybody does have any questions. But again, feel free to jump in, unmute, and ask questions about anything if something comes up for you. But if we can go then to the next slide, just having worked with folks using whatever sort of, idea, concept, strategy resonates the most with you and the child, the family, the person that you're working with. You've helped sort of drive home this idea that unhelpful thoughts about things can kind of, can contribute to to us feeling worse sometimes, and more helpful thoughts contribute to helping us feel better. We then just want to transition to the final 2 steps of this particular skill, which is to rehearse and practice helpful thinking, right? So once we've kind of identified more helpful ways of thinking about different situations and contexts, practice this skill throughout the week. Okay, so have folks kind of practice this particular skill throughout the week. Practice telling yourself that. Sometimes when I'm working with adults in particular, right, I might have folks write down on an index card a particular helpful thought and keep that with you. Pull it out and sort of look at it. Remind yourself of that from time to time. But another way that I think can be a really sort of fun a way to sort of help drive home some of these concepts for folks is, once you've identified helpful thoughts, have folks schedule activities so that they can test the accuracy of those different thoughts, right? And let me just give you an example of this, a real example of this, actually with a patient or with a client that I talked about at the very beginning of our Echo series. And for those of you who were here at the very beginning, you might remember this particular client was a lady that I was seeing about 6 weeks following a traumatic death of 3 people in her family. And in particular, about 3 or 4 sessions in to us doing SPR together, after we'd seen each other for a handful of sessions, she commented to me one day, my birthday is this weekend. And my niece, who was one of the individuals killed in the traumatic death involving several people in her family, her niece was very, very close to her, had always been there to celebrate birthdays with her. And she said, I really don't want to celebrate my birthday this weekend because she won't be there. And I think it's just going to be incredibly hard trying to do anything without her there. I won't enjoy it, but I feel like I have to do it for the kids because I need to create some conditions of normalcy for them, right? But that's the only reason I'm doing it, because I know I'm not going to enjoy this, and it's going to be overwhelming. And so we kind of stopped there and we talked a bit, about kind of the idea behind some of these helpful thinking skills. And in the course of us talking and kind of, thinking about problem solving, different ways of thinking about that situation, she really thought about something and came back and said, what, there may be moments throughout the day when we have my birthday party. There may be moments throughout the day where I do get really overwhelmed and I need to step out. But you know what? It's probably going to feel really good to see the kids laugh and smile again. So I bet I'll really enjoy that. She was like, so I'm going to give it a try. Let's do this. And then we kind of thought about what kind of things she could do for her party. And we decided, hey, let's test it. Come back. I want to know how it went. Were you able to enjoy any of those moments? Did it happen that way or did it not? Let's test that thought out, right? And so sometimes it's just as simple as that, right? Thinking about, are there little opportunities where I can start to experience something when I feel like maybe nothing else is possible, right? Identify those helpful ways of thinking about situations. So I think that's really kind of the idea behind these last 2 steps. But there are certainly some considerations that we want to keep in mind here. And some things that I'll just sort of advise folks to think about, particularly when doing a skill like this with kids. So if we go to the next slide, one thing that I'll just sort of remind folks to, when you're working with kids and when you're working with really young kids in particular, it's not uncommon that kids are going to adopt the beliefs or interpretations of events that may be particularly important for the adults in their lives, right? So we might be more likely to adopt beliefs or interpretations about disasters, post-disaster events, or scenarios that are consistent with the beliefs held by the important adults around us. So as much as possible, when you're working with kids, I think it's going to strongly be advised, or it's going to be strongly advisable or highly advisable to encourage their caregivers, those adults, to learn this skill and kind of learn how to do some of this on their own too, right? Encourage adults to identify their own problematic thoughts with a supportive interventionist and do that on their own without their kids present sometimes, right? Because really, as much as possible, we as adults want to also be there to create supportive environments for the kids around us. So in recognizing the thoughts that we may have that may be causing us the most pain, let's learn how to recognize those things and challenge those things on our own, because certainly kids will pick up on that, right? And kids will sometimes adopt those ideas. So I think with this skill, you're going to want to try to work with parents and caregivers as much as possible, sometimes on their own, and learning how to do some of this as well. And if parents and caregivers can learn how to do it, they're also better suited to help support kiddos and sort of learning the skill as well. But if we then go to the next slide, just one final caution here, and some of this we'll kind of get to when we talk about our, when we get into our breakout rooms and we talk about kind of how to identify helpful thoughts and what that process looks like. One thing you never want to do though, and I think this is where sort of, cognitive thinking kinds of interventions sometimes are a bit misunderstood. One thing we never want to do when we're trying to teach the skill is debate with somebody about whether a particular thought is justified or accurate. Right? We don't want to necessarily get into debates or arguments with folks, because the reality is that what you're thinking and what you're experiencing is your experience, right? And you've gone through this, and nobody can tell you how to think or feel about what you're going through right now, right? So we never want to get into debates about the validity or accuracy of thoughts. But the goal here really is to help identify thoughts that are going to help us feel more energized, right? And depending on different ways that this will resonate with folks, I've seen some literature on how to do cognitive interventions with folks from different cultural backgrounds. You can kind of frame this as, all thoughts have an element of truth to them, but we want to try to help expand, and I'm not, for lack of a better term, I'm going to make up a word here. You want to try to expand the truthiness of the thought, right? How do we sort of make that thought more truthful, right? How do we make it a more whole, more complete thought, right? Not to dismiss the validity of what anyone's thinking. So just, note that, keep that in mind, and let's see when we come back, if we as a group in our breakout groups and then as a full group can kind of get a little bit of practice under our belt for figuring out how do we take an unhelpful thought and turn it into a more helpful one, right? So appreciate everybody sort of sticking with us through the technological issues and everything else. But you know what, guys, we've had fun. So let's take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll keep the fun going.